Christian nationalists want to turn America into a theocracy, a government under biblical rule. If things go their way this election, it could mean more power for them and fewer rights for you. I'm Heath Drusen, and on the new season of Extremely American, I'll take you inside the movement that seeks to rebuild the country in God's image. Listen to Extremely American from Boise State Public Radio, part of the NPR network.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudet. You're listening to Idaho Matters. Yesterday, Donald Trump was sworn in again as the President of the United States.
Raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
He immediately began signing a slew of executive orders covering everything from what he called an invasion at the southern border to opening up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to oil exploration. And Trump even blocked Idaho's Lava Ridge wind project in the Magic Valley. He called Lava Ridge, quote, contrary to the public interest, unquote, and said it, quote, suffers from legal deficiencies. Well, then he directed the Secretary of the Interior to put a temporary moratorium on that project. So how else will the new Trump administration impact Idaho? Dr. David Adler, president of the Alturas Institute, has been examining the theme and the content of the 47th president's address to the nation yesterday for clues. He'll be speaking about it on Thursday at his first constitutional conversation of the new year, and he is joining us now for a preview. Nice to have you back, Dr. Adler.
Thank you for having me, Gemma. Good to be with you as well.
So, Dr. Adler, give us your first reaction to yesterday's inaugural speech.
You know, Gemma, it was not what we would regard as a conventional inaugural address, one that would reflect some soaring rhetoric talking about unifying the country, preaching the need for the United States to go forward, to put old battles in the rearview mirror, and to speak generally to the theme of unification. President Trump did say that he wanted to be known as a peacemaker and a unifier, but that statement rather resembles the title of a press release to a real estate deal that doesn't reflect the content of that deal, because no sooner than he had said that, Gemma, than he launched into a diatribe against his predecessor, Joe Biden, who was seated just steps behind him. And he ripped the previous administration and began to deliver words and policies and stated goals that would lead to further division and polarization in the country and not unification. As, for example, his statement that he intended to close the border, utilize the military because of the invasion, that he wanted to rename Denali Mount McKinley in honor of his new favorite president, William McKinley, who championed tariffs, that from this moment forward, the United States would recognize just two genders, that he would launch his massive deportation program, that, of course, he would end birthright citizenship, and that we were going to, quote, retake the Panama Canal, among other assertions. And so there really weren't the kinds of statements that we would look for, Gemma, when we talk about one of those quadrennial speeches aiming at unifying the country and gathering and drawing people together.
Well, with that said, in your talk coming up on Thursday, you will actually be looking at Trump's speech through a historical lens when two presidents were elected in a time of deep division. This is not the first time that our country has had such division. So tell us who those two presidents are and why you chose them.
Well, I chose Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln for their historic inaugural addresses, Jefferson in 1801 and Lincoln, of course, in 1861 and 1865, for precisely the reason you indicate, that the nation was torn by deep division. And there was a longing on the part of these two historic presidents to seek unity, and they offered reconciliation and magnanimity and an effort to extend a hand to those who were on the other side of their politics and policies and issues. Jefferson, of course, famously said in his inaugural address, "We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans," reflecting his goal that we're all Americans and we cannot be beset by deep divisions because we need to move forward in the spirit of compromise. And of course, he was more keenly aware than anybody about the deep division that characterized his election because after all he voted by the House of Representatives on the 36th ballot after he and his opponent John Adams had failed to win the necessary electoral college majority. And Lincoln, of course, came to the office in 1861 at a time that was unique in American history, Gemma. The South had already begun to secede, and he appealed to the South to stop the secession. And he said, "We are not enemies. We must not be enemies." And again, he spoke in the spirit of compromise and reconciliation. And he said in 1865, "With malice toward none." Malice toward none. What a thought. And so these two great presidents who delivered these inaugural address, which most historians will agree constitute the two finest among the many inaugural addresses in our history, set a high standard. And they speak to the idea that presidents should be presidents for all Americans, not just those in the party that elected them. And that's the kind of spirit that we want going forward. So I selected those two presidents, Gemma, as the high benchmark with the hope, not the expectation, but with the hope that in this moment, when Donald Trump arrives at the Oval Office, in having won a very very narrow victory, less than 1.5% of the popular vote, and certainly did not win a landslide in the Electoral College, that he might seek to reshape his image and truly try to become a unifier because there would be many issues where he could lead the way. After all, enjoying the hard support of his own party, all he had to do is to reach across the aisle a little bit and seek compromise. And compromise is the engine of democracy, as we like to say, to try to bring the country together in the Jeffersonian and Lincolnian spirit.
So, Dr. Adler, I would argue that this country has been deeply divided for much longer than Trump's been in office. We seem to have started seeing the cracks when President Obama was first in office in 2008, where there were people who honestly had an issue with a black person being president. From there, we then see Trump come into office, and I think it's fair to say that he used those divisions to gain power. And then we had Biden in office, where the divisions were even more so over those 4 years after the January 6th insurrection. Now we have Trump back in office. We are still a deeply divided nation. And I'm curious as to when you look at President Trump moving forward, as you said, maybe he does want to reshape his image, but there was no unity in the speech that he gave yesterday, whether you're looking at the inaugural speech or his speech later on in the day.
Well, you're quite right. This is a deeply divided nation. We're a very centrist nation, aren't we? And the elections are won by one party or the other by a very narrow margin. And it's certainly been a very long time since we've had any decisive elections. We would probably have to go back to 1984 and Ronald Reagan's second election to find an overwhelming victory. And that's a very long time ago. The nation certainly has changed a great deal since then. But to your point, which I agree with, that there were no unifying elements in President Trump's second inaugural address yesterday. It's the fact that he exercised the opportunity very quickly to lash out at his predecessor to essentially rehash old grievances. And you'd have to ask, well, why would you do that? You just won. Not only did you just win the White House, if you're Donald Trump, but your party has just captured uh, both houses of Congress. You will pull all the levers of power. This is certainly the time for magnanimity and goodwill to the other side. But he chose not to because that's not his personality. When he told us in his campaign that his campaign was going to be about retribution and vengeance, it appears that he's following that path and not the other path that he might have taken. And so I think that to the extent that he missed an opportunity to heal some wounds or to begin that process, he has just widened them and deepened them. And we're going to see now that his executive orders are going to seek to expand presidential power in a way that exceeds even the most audacious claims of presidential power in the past, including, Gemma, the deployment of the U.S. military on the southern border. And as you said in your intro, when he said that this is likened to an invasion, I think he's playing with that language because if he can assert with confidence and success that the United States is withstanding an actual invasion, then he can assert authority as commander in chief to defend the country against an invasion. If he can't persuade Congress that there is an invasion, then he cannot assert his power as commander in chief, but would have to seek from Congress a declaration of or an authorization to use military force. So the problem here is that he needs to win the public view that there's an invasion so he can trigger some constitutional authority and to assert some statutory authority, which he's already done, but he's running into big conflicts here. The Posse Comitatus statute of the 1850s forbids deployment of U.S. force to enforce domestic law. The Alien Enemies Act, which he invoked in his inaugural address yesterday, dating back to 1798, provides the president with authorization to detain and arrest and deport aliens in this country, but only if they are citizens of a country with which we are at war. And the last time I checked, Congress has not declared war against Mexico or Colombia or Guatemala or any of these other countries from which refugees are fleeing. And there are other statutes that he's now coming dangerously close to violating or will once he attempts to utilize his power and to enforce his goals and policies in the days and weeks ahead.
Dr. Adler, before we go to break, I do want to talk about these executive orders. And look, some people are upset about these executive orders. Some people are not. It depends upon, which side of the aisle you're on. And I think it's fair to say that no one seems to have an issue with executive orders or pardons when they agree with them. And when there is a president in office that you don't agree with, you then don't agree with executive orders and pardons. It is in President Trump's right as president to do these executive orders, whether we like them or not, to pardon, whether we like them or not. So can you quickly explain that he can do this? I mean, these executive orders, like the one that he did blocking Idaho's Lava Ridge wind project yesterday, he has the power to do that. Can they be challenged, though?
Well, you're certainly right about in your characterization of how Americans feel about executive orders and to some extent pardons as well. The reality is that the exercise of power to issue executive order goes all the way back to the days of George Washington, and they rest on one of two sources, either the president's constitutional authority or more often statutory authority that is delegated to the president. And in this particular case, yesterday, President Trump issued the sweeping order that represented a a real setback for the wind power industry when you speak about the Lava Ridge opportunity here, and he did block it, citing a statute as authority to essentially halt the process. And he did it in a way which essentially involves ordering the Secretary of Interior and other cabinet officials to take steps to make sure that the project does not proceed. And this applies to projects across the country as well. And the way he did this, of course, is to cite legal deficiencies, which is the particular way in which efforts are made to stop administrative agencies from proceeding, essentially claiming that after the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, held public hearings, that the BLM did not follow every procedural step, that there were I's that weren't dotted, T's not crossed, and now he's going to order his new departmental Secretary of Interior to begin a renewal process of review. And this simply slows down all the actions. And as for challenging these in court, yeah, certainly there are opportunities to go to court to challenge, but it's now all going to be bound up in procedure because the president has broad authority as the superintendent of these administrative agencies, including the BLM, to direct it at his pleasure. This is probably an imperfection in our system, one that's going to be exploited, I think, by President Trump to promote his views, certainly. But in court, the attorneys, let's say, for the LS company that was behind the Lava Ridge proposal, are going to say, no, the record was clean. There were no legal deficiencies, and this is going to take a lot of time. So for the time being and for some considerable time ahead, the project is going to be on hold, Gemma.
So, Dr. Adler, yesterday when Donald Trump was sworn into office, it seems that maybe Inauguration Day will be overshadowed by the 1,500 pardons, including to the 400 convicted of beating Capitol Hill police officers and members of the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers back during the January 6th insurrection. Can you put this exercise of the pardon power into historical context? And I'm curious how you believe it will be judged by scholars and other historians.
That's a great question, Gemma. Thank you. And I think you're right to say that the grant of pardons to the 1,600 defendants will serve to define the administration, will overshadow and define the administration. And I think at this juncture, it would be fair to say that it represents perhaps the most flagrant abuse of the pardon power in American history, or certainly one of the two or three most flagrant instances. I think that what it represents is, of course, number one, is it's an affront to law and order, because, as you pointed out, some 400 defendants anyway were convicted for assaulting police officers, some of whom were terribly injured and stricken with lifelong difficulties to deal with. And it represents a terrible assault on the rule of law because some members of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers were convicted for seditious conspiracy. That is the use of force to attempt to overthrow the government. And for a president who has the constitutional duty under Article 2 to, quote, take care to faithfully execute the laws of the land. This is not executing the laws, even though the president has the power to grant pardons. It is an exercise that defies law and order and common sense. And so I think to put it in historical perspective, this particular pardon power exercise, which was the fulfillment of a central campaign promise, perhaps ranks only second in self-serving pardons to that granted by President George H.W. Bush in 92, when he pardoned Secretary of Defense Cap Weinberger and others involved in the Iran-Contra affair. because when he pardoned Cap Weinberger, who had recorded in his notes that then Vice President George Bush knew of the Iran-Contra affair, it was only a matter of a few steps and a few days before then President George Bush, leaving office at the end of his term in 1992, would have been indicted by the special counsel. And so by pardoning Weinberger, Bush essentially pardoned himself. That's the most egregious, most flagrant, self-serving exercise of the pardon power. But the pardon granted yesterday, all the pardons granted yesterday by President Trump, are flagrant because they do offend the rule of law. And it doesn't seem to me possible any longer for Trump to say that he's a fan or admirer of the men and women in blue, that he's an advocate of law and order, because these people stormed the Capitol, we have to remember, at his insistence. And they attempted to thwart the personal, peaceful transfer of power and did halt it for several hours. And so this was an effort, I think, for the first time in our history, to pardon members of a paramilitary unit, which is pretty frightening because we don't talk about that in American history. That occurs in other nations. But having told the Proud Boys to stand back and to stand by and to pardon them now means they're indebted to him. They owe him a lot. And the fearful question that we have to address is what would they do for President Trump if he makes an odd request at some point? Would they attempt to break up, for example, in the future, a protest against some of Trump's policies? These are questions that we would not have raised in the scope of American history. We now have to address that because a president has just freed people who belong to a paramilitary unit whom he asked to stand back and to stand by, to be ready at his beck and call. And that's a pretty fearful moment, Gemma.
Well, Dr. Adler, we appreciate your perspective on this. We've been speaking with Dr. David Adler, president of the Alturas Institute, talking about his next constitutional conversation, which will happen this Thursday at 4 at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in Boise. We will, of course, put a link to the talk on our website, boisestatepublicradio.org. I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.
If you like podcasts like this, explore more from the Boise State Public Radio podcast family. There you'll find a mix of daily news, Idaho Voices, and in-depth series on a wide range of topics. I'm talking wild horses, political scandals, sustainable ranching, and militia groups in a post-January 6th world. Wherever you get your podcasts, just search Boise State Public Radio to find what Idaho's NPR station has in store for you.